So, Seminar 2, Lecture 3, Individuation, Self, and Demiurge. The theme motivating these seminars is remembering Sophia. And one might ask, what does that have to do with this long lament of the dead? Well, the myth of Sophia is part of the legacy of the dead, of our dead. It's a myth that, for many people, has died. But not just a myth. It was a story told by human lives, explaining life itself. Underneath the words of this myth, there was an experience of life. It was a story about life. Human history was telling a story. Conceptual thoughts, words, were in relationship with the depths, the world of image, and the facts of life. Consider again the primal image, the image of beginnings. Hear the words of the dead from Proverbs, scribed 2,400 years ago. And this is a lyric of the song of Sophia. The Lord formed me from the beginning, before He created anything else. And when He marked off the earth's foundations, I was the architect at His side. I was His constant delight, rejoicing always in His presence. The I speaking in Proverbs is Sophia, wisdom. And again, reflect on what I called Act 1 of that prologue of the story of Sophia from Gnostic myth. An eye opens. He sees she is present with him. The Lord in His delight, nous and epinoia, logos and Sophia, mind and image, a lover and a beloved. They are together from the beginning. This is not a conceptual language, and it's not a metaphysics. It's a story imaginatively at play. It might be taken as a tale about the nature of consciousness. Image is thought form, the primal idea or the stuff animating ideation. It mingles with mind. It is seen by mind. The Greek word idea has a root, and that root means to see. In the Indo-European languages, the root is vid, like in video, vision, to see. Idea, vidya. Mind sees, image. They are in relationship. All else follows upon this fact. In the portions of the dialogue that we have just read between Shamdasani and Hillman, they were together struggling with the nature of conceptual psychology and its language. Concepts are in relation with experiences of the psyche. They play together. Neither is the other. One does not denote the other. Last month in the seminar on Remembering Sophia, I talked about precept and percept, about syntax and semantics. Syntax being the fixed structure, a logic. Precepts are things that exist beforehand into which we place experience, conceptualize, define. Percepts, perceptions, are obtained in the motion of life, in passing through experience. Semantics are meanings, derived. And these concepts, I suggested, are orthogonal domains. They are at right angles to each other, but they do cross. They do touch. And I asked last time whether your psychology was found or found its ground in precepts or in perceptions. Was it a psychology based on syntactical structures of mind, conceptual categories, or the semantics of experience? And it was objected that one need not or should not choose one or the other. One doctor here objected that the supposed dichotomy was just simply false. It was not psychology, not what he did. He used both. They were in relationship. And then another discussant, I believe it was what Ruth said, that they were in play together at all times, that they moved and they changed together. Well, I agree. They move together. They dance together. They are related. But if one allows such a relationship, then all explanatory precepts become mutable. And that's my point. All fixed and denotative dogmas, teachings, fail. Explanatory principles become fluid, mutable. The intractable, the seemingly intractable, is moved. The intractable, what we consider to be the defining precept, the defining language, the syntax of understanding. And one is left with this relational dance. All precepts now lay open to modification by experience. And that is wisdom. That is Sophia. Fixed cosmologies turn, the explanatory principle changes. Precepts that once seemed immutable are discarded. New ones slowly form and solidify in their place, only to fracture again. The human story, our story, moves. The gods themselves undergo transformation across aeons of time. Human history and our dead stand as our witnesses of this gradual turning of time. Jung saw we were at the threshold of a momentous turning, a momentous turning. And the dead were present with us in this moment. This is a history of psychology. It's the record of our experience of the soul. And Jung argued that there can be no psychology without history. By recalling the human record, the dead, history can, as Shamdasani said, move the seemingly intractable. But what is the intractable fact, seemingly intractable fact of our age? If there be psychology after Jung's Red Book, history will have a part in psychology. As they finished off that last dialogue saying, history is a therapist and a major player in the fact of life. Every physician learns that history is the most important factor in making a diagnosis. As an old professor told me years ago, the most important thing in any encounter with a patient, well, he said there are three most important things. He said they're history, history, and history. And when I said that, I thought this was some sort of a Trishagian, a thrice great holy. But what I really have come to understand over the years is what he means is you have to listen to history. Then you have to listen again to history. And then you have to listen again to history. And I've also learned over the years that every time you listen, you hear it differently. You hear more. It really is so. History's in the game. I said life is a sexually transmitted disease, and the mortality is 100%. Actually, I didn't say that. Crazy R.D. Laing said that. And it is so terribly true, and so to the point that it amuses us to think it. We cannot ethically do away with the causal agent of this disease, sexuality. Perhaps the computers will do that for us someday in the not too distant future. And we cannot, it seems, alter the mortality rate, which is 100%, although we seem to be trying awfully hard. History assures us of this fact of mortality. So in the therapeutic arts, one is realistically left just to do the best one can with the suffering in the middle part, between sex and death. Happy thought. Theories of psychology must remain in touch with these sorts of facts of life. The facts of human suffering and their history. History is a therapist and a therapeutic factor. And it's also very interesting. The story of the dead. All sorts of people in the last generation, actually, have gone looking for their roots. This is something that comes out. It's a human need. Living things have roots in the dead. Let me talk a little bit about Hillman and Jung. In their fourth conversation, Shamdasani asked Hillman, "What is it that from your perspective today strikes you about this book?" And this is what Hillman answered. He said, "The book somehow validated what I felt I was doing all these years without knowing it. I mean, my therapy of myself and my therapy with others, whenever possible, focused on active imagination, dialogues, encounters with figures, and teaching and learning how to deal with figures. So personification seemed to me absolutely the essential activity of the psyche, just as Jung says or shows in the Red Book. So all of the things that I was doing and trying to write about were all there in what Jung was doing in the Red Book. So new. So that was the legacy you took up, and without knowing that that was the case." Hillman. "But I didn't know that was the legacy. I didn't know it was so overt in the Red Book." He didn't know. Later, towards the end of these conversations, and Hillman is getting sicker as these conversations go on, the conversations get shorter. Later on he says, "Why didn't I have this book?" And he was not alone in not knowing this. Few people intuited the depths within that mystery of Jung's so-called confrontation with the unconscious. Hillman did, however, during his life, have a huge issue of disagreement with Dr. Jung. And it was potent. It rubbed him entirely wrong. One might chalk it up to a conceptual disagreement, supposed. But for Hillman, it personally went much deeper. Hillman interpreted this Jungian concept of the self, a key concept of Jung's, if it be seen as a concept, to be nothing but a monotheistic God in disguise. The self was, in Hillman's view, a pernicious concept that poisoned Jung's psychology. He wanted nothing to do with it. He refused to bow down to Jehovah, even dressed in Jungian terminological drag, and called by name of the self. This has been actually my own personal main problem with Hillman in past years. Hillman did not understand the self, or at least in this regard, understand Jung. But of course he was not alone. As best I can tell, many people spoke and still speak about the self with a capital S in a conceptual way that indicates a misunderstanding. And it is complex. It needs a little more wisdom, or Sophia, to understand. Dr. Michael Adams, who's a therapist in New York with decades of experience, who's been a friend and a very firm supporter of Hillman's archetypal psychology for many, many years, spoke about this central issue in a conference in England in 2006. He noted, and I quote, "Hillman hardly ever mentions the self." And then Adams continues, and I'll quote, "What he, Hillman, knew was that in order to revision conservative, conventional Jungian psychology, he had to rebut what he calls the dogma of self-domination. The self has dogmatically dominated Jungian psychology. And Hillman knew very well that he had to repudiate it." This is Adams talking about his friend Hillman. I continue. "One reason why Hillman considers the self dispensable is that he advocates an imaginal psychology rather than a conceptual psychology. The self is a concept, not an image. For Hillman, concepts are abstract generalizations, in contrast to images, which are concrete particularizations. Another reason why Hillman considers the self dispensable is that it is not just any concept. In Jungian psychology, the self is the concept of concepts. The self is the concept with a capital C. It is God with a capital G. It is Yahweh with a capital Y, or Yod. Prominent among the psychological qualities that the self, as a concept, shares with Yahweh, Adams continues, is what I call jealousy of image. From this perspective, images are idolatrous, and the self as a concept is iconoclastic. Yet another reason why Hillman considers the self dispensable is that it reduces multiplicity to unity. Rather than reduce the many and different images to one and the same concept, the self, a conceptual unity, Hillman radically affirms imaginal multiplicity and alterity. From the perspective of conservative, conventional Jungian psychology, Hillman is an idolater. Not a Moses of the self, but an Aaron of images." End quote. So, was Jung's self the jealous God? Is that what Jung offered as a central focus and the ultimate expression of his psychology? A monotheistic God image, a replacement twin of Jehovah, Yahweh. The self and the process of individuation in Jung's conceptual language are inextricably linked. The self was, in Jung's view, the rare human result of individuation. The result of individuation. It is not, I suggest to you, just a concept, but a rare, perhaps even extraordinarily rare event. We should recognize that Jung's conceptual language was a manner of speaking about human experience. Consciously engaged and reflected, fantasy was an effort of two worlds being wed by one human life. Ours, his, yours. It was a rare mythopoetic journey, the fullness of life. This individuation was. Few were wayfarers who took this journey and wed these domains in life. Jung understood himself to be such a wayfaring man. If If one is to understand anything about Jung, it starts with this foundational fact. This wedding of life, of outer and inner life, of image and fact of life. And that is the Red Book, a foundational fact. Dr. Shamdasani states, Liber Novus presents the prototype of Jung's conception of the individuation process. Well, prototype is the first type. It's what happened to Jung. I have always personally disliked that term, individuation. There is a sense in this word of the individual, in a very egoistic, solipsistic sense. And that solipsistic sense is the antithesis of what Jung meant by individuation. The events in the Red Book were Jung's own process of individuation. His task was to directly meet and accept the reality of the depths and the dead. They are part of life, half of a world in which we dwell. Then he needed to integrate this experience of the depths with the totality of his life, bring it into conjunction with his way of thinking, his way of understanding, and his way of navigating the daylight world. He had to hold the tension of the two, of the thought and the image. Outer and inner, it was all wed together. They touch at the center of life. In his later writings, Jung called individuation a rare and a difficult process. In words written in 1940, Jung described individuation thus, and I quote, "Because individuation is an heroic and often tragic task, the most difficult of all, it involves suffering, a passion of the ego. The ordinary, empirical man we once were is burdened with the fate of losing himself in a greater dimension and being robbed of his fancied freedom." As a result of the integration of conscious and unconscious, his ego enters the divine realm. Do you hear that strange shift in terminology in that last sentence? Integration of conscious and unconscious, his ego, and then all of a sudden, the divine realm. Isn't that strange? The conceptual language all of a sudden touches this sort of mythic language. One enters this divine realm by this wedding. Integration of conscious and unconscious, mind meeting imaginal, fantastic, even chaotic facts, and entering the divine realm. Put that together, it sounds like madness. Madness is the danger, and it is a constant lurking possibility. Individuation demanded the empirical fact of our known self, what we call me. Surrender its claim of sovereignty, its sense of ultimate freedom as master of the house. The solitary ego is hung on a cross of mystery. Inner and outer infinites penetrate, and we become the point of their union, a bridal chamber of their union. If we can hold the tension of these opposites in balance. And this is more or less how Jung described the self. These are experiential events. They're mysterious weddings or unions or crossings. Jung thought the history of the hieroskamos, the sacred wedding in Western tradition, was actually of psychological interest. History. He wrote about this hieroskamos at great length. This history was part, he felt, of psychology. It was apparently to Jung a burden of understanding something that had been left to us by the dead, our dead. This mythic, imaginal, and human event is storied. It is part of our history. Some people have made records of such strange experiences, and Dr. Jung did too. The story even has a love mysticism as its legacy. These records are part of the creative imagination of humanity. Evidences of this imaginative event and its effects flash up in history. They are beacons of history. Sometimes they sound like love stories. Sometimes they are histories of a man and a woman, or of a lover and the great beloved. Lovers of the soul. In that storied union, the rational image of oneself as a woman or a man of a time, this time, confronted the timeless, a spirit of the depths, the endless realm of the dead. Individuation is thus not a concept, it's not a theory, nor is it a philosophical abstraction. The term individuation is a nomenclature for a life experienced. It was what Jung named the experience he had endured. Maybe it was a bad choice of words. Personally, I think it was. The word is counterintuitive. But it was the best he could do at that time. Conceptually, one struggles to find terms that meet the facts of life. Life as experienced. In his conversation with Hillman, this subject of individuation came up. And Dr. Shamdasani commented, individuation is also not necessarily the best chosen word. He adopted it from Schopenhauer and von Hartmann because it depicts in Jung's understanding a passage away from solipsism. Away from solipsism. Solus ipse. All by yourself. Just you. Individuation was not that. It was meeting the other. It was relationship. So Sonu said, that's the whole point. It's an opening of the contemporary world, an opening to the dead and the deeply personal. And the deeply personal is connected back through history. It's connected to all that has been left out. It is a recollection. A remembering. An anamnesis. And Hillman says, yes, that would be perfect. An anamnesis, a remembering. That's what we should call this individuation. That would be perfect for what this work is. And Sonu replied, for recollecting the forms that animate us. For recollecting the forms that animate us. Anima, give life. And then Hillman continues, recollecting the forms that animate us, the forms that are neglected, forgotten, and feared, mainly feared, not ours. The process is one of connecting, of connection or restoration or remembrance, Hillman says. Why don't we call it that? The process of remembering. Anamnesis. Yes, indeed. Remembering. That is what Jung meant. That is what I wished to imply by calling this series of lectures a remembering of Sophia. But actually, the word more specifically is an amnesis. It means unforgetting. We have forgotten something. The task before remembering is knowing that we have forgotten something. I deal with this every time I go to the store and I'm told to get something. Okay? Usually somebody has written the thing I need to get in the store on a slip of paper. But I get in the car and I forget the slip of paper. And I say to myself, I will remember when I get to the store. Been there? Done that? Then I get to the store. I get everything. And then you're sitting in the damn checkout line. And trying to remember if you've forgotten. Have I forgotten? Isn't that the first question? Well, let me tell you. The reason what I was supposed to get at the store was written on a slip of paper is because it has been proven, empirically, that I forget. And then, of course, when one gets home, one faces the consequences of the forgetting. Again. However, our age does not know it has forgotten. It is unaware of there being anything to have forgotten. And we are facing the repercussions, the fact of an absence, a result of our forgetting. We are so full of our new powers of memory and our web and clouds of memory that our manifold forgetting has been forgotten. How does one arouse awareness of forgetting? Jung certainly tried. And maybe the Red Book is now a stimulus to seeing the things forgotten and remembering, even remembering the dead. In answer to Job, near the end of his life, Jung pointed to the myth of this age, the myth that needs to be remembered, being connected to an amnesis of Sophia, remembering Sophia. But of course, remembering is more than remembering. There is a conceptual domain, a bunch of old words or scriptures, which we need to study or think about more. I mean, plenty of people do that with rather limited results. In some mysterious fashion, this remembering is a coming back to the intimacy of a relationship. Our mental constructs, our powers of mind, must regain contact with the subtle fact of life, the earth and blood and abundant breath of the imaginal realm present in physical fact, living with us in the physical fact, in the reality, in the cosmos, in this tissue of life. It's present in the tissue of our life. It is part of our nature. That was one of Giegrich's complaints about Jung. I just note now. He talked about Jung's naturalistic imagination. Well, you know, it is nature. It is naturalistic. Jung says we cannot leave it all on the dung heap of the past, with the rotting corpses of our dead. I previously read a text from the Nag Hammadi collection entitled On the Origin of the World. Think about this again. This was written 1800 years ago. A memory from the dead. Sophia sent Zoe, her daughter, who is called Eve, as an instructor in order that she might raise up Adam. When Eve saw her companion, who was so much like her, she exclaimed, "Adam, live, rise up upon the earth." Immediately her words worked. Adam rose up, opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, "You will be called Mother of the Living, because you are the one who gave me life." In the secret book of John, another Gnostic text found at Nag Hammadi, The story is told in a similar way. Sophia says, "He who hears, let him arise from deep sleep." Remember. Remember. And Adam wept and shed tears. After he wiped away his bitter tears, he spoke, asking, "Who is it that calls my name? And from where has this hope come to me? While I am in the chains of this prison of forgetting." She answered, "I am the foreknowing of pure light. I am the thought of the undefiled spirit. Arise and remember. Arise and remember. And follow your route. And beware of the deep sleep, the deep forgetting. From where has this hope come to me?" And Sophia answered, "I am the thought of the undefiled spirit." She isn't the undefiled spirit. She's the thought of this spirit. The reality that exists in relation with the spirit. I am the epinoia of nous, the conception of mind. I am the Sophia of Logos, the wisdom of Logos. I am the living fact of image, met by you. I am a wedding with the one who has been called whore and virgin. Arise and remember, follow your route, and beware of the deep sleep. In Aeon, or Ion as it's called, perhaps Jung's most important work, one he wrote after his own near-death experience in 1944. He breathes expressive life into his conceptual word, individuation. And in this work he uses the Latin words he used or first employed in the Red Book, Principium Individuationis. Jung quotes from an ancient Gnostic text preserved by Hippolytus as he's trying to explain his meaning, what he means by individuation. And he concludes saying, quote, "Individuation is a mysterium conjunctionis, a mystery of conjunction. The self being experienced as a nuptial union of two opposite halves." Individuation is a mystery of conjunction. The self being experienced as a nuptial union of two opposite halves. Well, what are those halves? The conceptual words, conscious and unconscious, pale before the task of adequately telling this tale. But you see, those are the words we've been using. I struggled for years trying to give talks about individuation using these words. It is a myth, or a mythological psychology. It is a map of human experience. But the map, the concept, is not the experience. And imaginal psychology needs further understanding of mythopoiesis, the myth in psychology, the myth-making function in us. And I think Hillman allowed that, certainly allowed that in his conversations in the last 2 years of his life with Sonu Shamdasani. Last time I showed you this ancient Gnostic symbol. It was an image in words, or words in image. 2 words of 3 letters each. Greek words, each with an omega as the central of the 3 letters. Phos, light, and Zoe, life. Light, phos, Zoe, life. Orthogonal, at right angles. And they cross. They touch in the omega, in that central wedding chamber, the thalamus. It is an image, but is it an image expressing an experience? Jung felt symbols were the best possible expression of this mysterious experience. Symbol is an expression of the experience brought into sensuous form, into perceptible form. That is what the Red Book was in part. Is that enigmatic cross from 2,000 years ago, of two words, a symbolic image of the experience of union, which Jung called the self. Light, life. Or is it a map? A map of the individuation process, to again resort to a conceptual term. That symbol, those thoughts, those experiences, those maps, are a legacy of the dead. One of the rejected treasures that Jung turned to and remembered. And this is the legacy to which he gave both his interests and his hermeneutics for the decades after he heard the lament of the dead in 1914. The Demiurge. But the story, this mythological psychology of Sophia, does have a complication. I mean, I've talked about a lot of this bright wedding stuff, okay? There's one more player on the stage in this tale. It's the Demiurge. Where does it fit? First, let me repeat my rendition of the plot, a mythic image from history. And it's a story that was recorded in different ways in several voices who are now among our dead. This is my own living way of telling it, but it is true to the tradition. It's part of Sophia's myth. Sophia, as you'll remember the story from last time, Sophia has leapt into the depths towards her projection. She's fallen into the depths, and she has no partner. She has no syzygy. They have all fallen away. She's alone. She's utterly alone in the void of all potential. And something stirs in her womb. From her there separated a being of incredible power. He was a monstrous, glorious being, full of splendorous, singular creativity. This fiery fact was filled with will and thoughts that became his unlimited creative powers. In classical Gnostic myths, he is called the Demiurge, the lesser force of creation. And he had several other names, among them Yaldabaoth and Saklas. Jung called him Abraxas. This Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, Abraxas, marshaled a host of formative forces, agents, archons of his power, and they molded the world. He then declared himself its master. He called himself the God of the world, the God above all gods, the one and only God. And next he tried to form man from the earth, in his image, to serve and worship him. But the result was a piteous, malformed clot of earth. This is the myth. Sophia witnessed the fiery domain being fashioned by this malefic and incomplete progeny. And she looked at the lump of clay he had formed, and she was overwhelmed with compassion. She breathed into it the spirit of life. She gave her life to earth. And then humankind arose. So who is this Demiurge? When we discussed this image last week, I mentioned that several Jungians looking at Gnostic myth have related this Demiurge to the concept of ego, who says he is the only God, the one and only, the powerful one. There's no other power before him or me. And, of course, the ego, us, me, our thought, is infinitely creative. He is a master of creative powers of imagination. He brings imagination to form in his own image. He forms the lumps of clay of this world into his servants, his slaves. We do this. Our imaginative potential does this. All you have to do is look at the fire of this creativity in our culture. Is that what the Demiurge is? Is that it? Is the Demiurge like ego, or is it more like maybe some sort of shadow of us? Or is it another concept, another magic name? Is this demiurge a sign denoting some other conceptual framework? In other words, ego concept equals demiurge. Monotheism equals demiurge. Shadow equals demiurge. A syntax of logical equivalence. All denotative, each marking the other. Is it that? And when we were talking about this last time, when we were talking about this myth of the demiurge, I remember Karen said, is this demiurge, is that a metaphor or is that monotheism? Okay, there's one way of looking at it. I'm the one and only God. Is it that? In this denotative working of a conceptual language, one sees that the self is not Yahweh. The self is not Yahweh, as Hillman seemed to think, or as Michael Adams wrote. Who then is Yahweh in this mythic framework? Well, for Jung, Yahweh is the demiurge in this conceptual equalization. And Hillman missed this. And Jung says this very explicitly in answer to Job. He says it in his Black Book Journal in 1916. This is one way ancient Gnostics also saw it. It's not the self that's Yahweh. It's not the self that is that God, to which Hillman objected. It's Jehovah. Jehovah is the demiurge. And of course, in saying this, the ancient Gnostics got themselves into a bit of hot water. And sometimes into the fire. Calling somebody else's God a demon, a hellish one at that, can cause problems. Even when you are speaking psychologically. Or consider another possibility here in closing. A psychological possibility. If the self is a human experience, as I was implying, an experience of a union, could the demiurge be an imaginal way of characterizing something else met in human experience? It's not a concept, it's an experience. Do we meet a demiurge who holds us in his thrall as servants? Chained, crazy, depressed, addicted, drunk with and sick of life, snarling angry at the end of our chains, ready to die, just die, and maybe tonight. Are we held by such things sometimes? Is there something in the psyche that subverts the intentions, the rule of this demiurge? Is there something within us that calls to us when we are in those chains, snarling, lost, addicted, utterly devoid of hope? Is there something in us that calls, Adam, awake, arise? Might a human have an experience of that voice and awake? Open his eye and see. Might there be such hope? You know, as I'm reflecting on this, I think that's very much part of the mythos of AA, isn't it? I've had several good friends who have been involved in really at a psychological level with the whole AA thing, looking at it as a Gnostic myth. I have a friend at the U now who's a graduate student who's really looking at AA as an example of a Gnostic mythology. As experience, not as concept. The experience of that event of awakening when you're really at the bottom. Who is this voice that calls to me while I am in these chains? That's what the old Gnostic myth said. Is this Demiurge outside of us? Is it a metaphor for kings and evil rulers in high worldly places, including departments of theology and institutes of psychology? Is he the ego who thinks he is all alone? Or is this Demiurge a power more deeply within us? For many people, the psychic land is not a pleasant place. It has its keepers of hell, and a ruler who says there is nothing more. This hell is it. People do descend into that chaos of image, and it can kill them. It does kill them. It does kill them. It takes their lives. Or it has them take their life as an escape from hell. Could the Demiurge come down to that sort of an imaginal encounter? Could these myths be psychological reflections upon the human condition? Is that part of this story of life? Imagined, consciously reflected 2,000 years ago. Jung seemed to think so. It was a psychology that accepted the reality of the image and the fantasy as facts. And there is a power who wants to have it all in us, and he is not nice. Could a person 2,000 years ago have had an experience similar to Dr. Jung's? Let me ask you that. Is that beyond imagination? Could such an experience be the source of a myth, such as this myth of the figure of the Demiurge and of Sophia? Was fantasy a primal seed to the hermeneutics, the primary formation and sensuous reality of this tale, scribed by a human hand on papyrus so many years ago? Might a woman or a man have seen the curtain of outward reality swept away and met there behind the veil a figure of fiery powers who held the world captive? Could they? And might the authors, temporal fellows 2,000 years ago, have read the tale with the same curious eye with which we meet the Red Book today? A new book. A new hermeneutics. That's what Elaine Pagels called Gnostic mythology. A new hermeneutics of myth. A new hermeneutical language. Did they even ask, must I seek an interior message and a messenger? Where is the awakening voice? Must I too meet Philemon in the land of the dead and hear stories and thus understand what is going on in our time, in this time of extraordinary change? Mythmakers or psychologists in this Gnostic tradition seemed to be doing something like that 2,000 years ago. They embraced the visionary world. Jung said that he had recognized the first evidences of experiences like his own in the writings of the Gnostics. He met them. They were among his dead. Of course, such questions involve a concern with the sensuous reality of the dead, experiences of the dead, the voice of the dead, the lament of the dead, the fact of life and death, the fact that we too are among the dead and will be forever among them soon enough. But we're alive now. What is our responsibility to life, to this life? What is life? And who is this Sophia, who is the mother of life? the bride in life, the one who is called a virgin and a whore. What's up? Are you crazy enough to go asking questions like that? I suppose that makes crazy people into psychologists. Or one type of psychologists. Psychologists involved with the phenomena, the sensuous reality of the psyche. Theorize all you want. Just keep the concepts in intimate relationship with the experience of life. Fantasy was a key experience for Jung. It was the transcendent function. It was the fact in individuation. Meeting the two worlds, bringing them together in consciousness. That is noted several times in the dialogue we just read between Sonu and Hillman. Fantasy is the Red Book. This is a document of mythopoetic imagination. The story of the Demiurge was of interest to Jung. In his later hermeneutics, he read the old story of the Demiurge as a psychological myth, a story reflecting human experience. Jung approached this term, seeing experience of the imaginal world, as a source of myths like this. Conceptual language of theology serves very little to understand this sort of madness, this vision stuff. This vision stuff, and the hermeneutics of vision is what theology usually calls heresy. And it has a long history. We should note that heretics are prominent among the company that Jung kept with the dead. This is the history of life, our dead. Look at them, look what they struggled with, because you do too. And so do I. And none of us fully understand it. We just don't know what we're doing, and we don't know what to call it. Thank you. It's time for lunch.
All right.